What's about to happen? And it's me going first. We'll see.
You're on.
Oh. I think we're ready to get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of conference. Did you all have fun at Data Night Out last night? Yeah? This session is monkeying about with survey data. Thank you all for coming along, especially after a big night out. My name is Archana, and I'm a senior product consultant from across the pond in London, and I'm happy to be here presenting for the second time at one of our US conferences.
And my name is Tanu, or Tanushree, and I'm a product consultant from a bit further away in the Singapore office. And I'm extremely excited to be here because this is my first time in conference. So just a show of hands, how many other fellow first-timers do we have here?
Wow.
Wow. Well, welcome. Great, isn't it? I mean, they tell you the conference is fun, but after Data Night Out, I just hope I get to come back next time. So I am beyond psyched, and I'm still pinching myself that I'm standing here today, because it was less than a year ago that I was sitting, that's me, at my desk in Singapore, going through all the videos from conference in New Orleans. Was anyone who was here before able to go to New Orleans? So it seems like seems like quite a few of you. So there was a lot of good stuff in that conference as well, and I came across this session that Archana had presented last year, and I absolutely loved it. At the time, a lot of my customers were working with survey data. I had worked with the internal Tableau marketing team on their survey data, so I was particularly sensitive of the kind of challenges that tend to come with such data sets. So I would keep revisiting this session, and I'd add on to it with the content that I'd gained over the practical experience that I gained over that year. And as any student does, I caught up with my teacher and professor, Archana, earlier this year in January during our annual sales kickoff, and I a little bit fangirled her over when I met her, in the most cool way possible, of course. And then she gave me quite a bit of encouragement, and one thing led to another. And 8 months down the line, I'm here presenting a session that I absolutely loved on a product which I'm so passionate about with someone that I'm completely in awe of. And with that, I want to introduce my role model, Archana Ganeshalingam.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Thanu. And little did I know that I was signing up for a long-distance relationship when I agreed to do this presentation. We were working across multiple time zones, and I'm sure all of you know just how important and, let's be honest here, frustrating technology can be. How many of you guys are familiar with this type of a conversation? Somehow we did manage to figure it out, and now it's a two-way love story. Thanu hyped me up at the beginning of her introduction, but now it's my turn to gush. She has pushed me to be so much better and take this session to the next level by thinking up ways to show you all the new features that have been added into prep since the last year when I presented it. So I've learned so much from working with her, and I hope all of you do too as well. So as Thanu said, I presented this session last year after I'd written 2 blog posts for our website, because there was a gap in resources for our customers on our website when it comes to working with survey data. No one really knew how to structure their data in terms of how to go about analyzing it. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So what this session is just to provide you with some guidance to help you get started. And so with that, we'll go on to the aims for the session. We're going to wave goodbye to Thanu for a moment. She's going to be back for the demos. And let's get into it. So I want all of you to leave being able to identify the different types of questions used in surveys, understand why survey data needs to be reshaped and cleaned for analysis, and of course, how to do this using Tableau Prep and Desktop. This session is rich in content, so I don't want you guys to have to worry about making notes and taking pictures of the slides, because we're actually being live streamed right now. There's a camera just back there, so I'm just going to say hi to everyone watching. And you'll have access to the session recording and, of course, all the materials post-conference. During this session, we're going to be using a survey from last year about the Tableau Conference 2018 experience. So let's take a look at the types of questions asked. First up, there were demographic attributes. These are the questions you want to group your respondents by, so things like gender, age, income, ethnicity. In our survey, we asked them, what role do you have at conference? Are you a customer, or are you an employee, a vendor, or a partner? Then we've got single select questions, where you can only choose one from a list of options. In our survey, it was, what are you most excited to do here? Then we've got multiple select questions that are check all that apply, that let you choose as many as you want from a list. So in our survey, the obvious one is, which products from the Tableau platform do you use? And finally, we have like at scale questions that ask you to rate something on a scale. And I'm hoping all of you guys rate our session 5 stars. These questions can also be text-based, like this one asking how friendly the hotel staff were, because they can easily be converted into numbers. The extremely friendly could be a score of 5, and the not at all friendly could be a score of 1. Remember that every survey tool is different, so the output you get might need slightly different steps to reshape and clean the data. In this session, we're going to be covering some of the most common challenges that the both of us have come across in our time working with customers. So, to start, you need to get the data, and there are 3 usual options. To download the data as an Excel or a CSV file, connect directly via Google Sheets, some tools let you do this, and then in other cases, you might just want to push to a database, especially for bigger surveys with thousands and thousands of respondents. And in some cases, the survey tools you use might have a web data connector option. These are especially handy in the case of SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, because they allow you to reshape the data upon import, so you can actually skip those steps entirely. But with that, I'm going to take a look at what the typical output of survey data is. Typically, survey data is structured like this, a row per respondent. It's easy for us to understand as we can read across and know exactly the profile of the person. Take, for example, Danu. She uses desktop and online. She's here to party. Woo! She didn't fly in, but she's happy with how clean her hotel is. It's pretty easy. But when you bring this into Tableau, your reaction might look a little something like this. And that's because if you have a lot of questions in your survey, you're going to end up with a huge number of dimensions and measures to sift through. Remember, dimensions are categorical variables, so these are the ones that are your survey questions, while the measures are the quantitative variables, so things like those ratings or account distinct of your respondents. And as with any other data set, Tableau works best when we're working with tall and thin data rather than short and wide, so think fewer columns and more rows. Most survey analysis begins with getting to know your respondents, of course, the frequency of observations, and also discovering outliers that could be fraudulent. So let's jump into prep to see how we would do this. And I'm going to awkwardly duck behind our screen just to switch. There we go. So for those of you guys who've not seen prep before, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the interface as well. So let me go ahead and connect to my data. I've already got it saved. It's just an Excel file in this case. I'll double click to connect, and I'm going to drag and drop out my text responses table. In the input step, I can see a list of all the fields that I'm bringing in. So I've got my demographics, the questions I asked, and then also a final field for comments given. I can go in and add a step to my flow pane. The flow pane shows me all the steps I take to clean and reshape my data from input all the way through to output. So let me go ahead and add a clean step, and that's what allows the profile pane to load up. And this allows me to do exactly the thing I mentioned earlier of looking at the frequency of observations, because the profile pane has these histograms built in that let me sort, for example, to see which country do most of the attendees come from. Of course, it's the United States. The profile pane is also handy to start spotting outliers. Take, for example, this duration field. It's telling me that someone took over 8,500 seconds to complete this survey. And this probably means that the survey timed out, or they just left the window open, and maybe we don't want to include their response in our analysis. So right from this window, I can go ahead and right-click and exclude that value. It's as simple as that. The last thing I'm going to mention is the data grid. This just gives me an Excel-like view of the underlying data so that I can see all the rows that make up my data set. One thing you'll notice with this particular survey tool is it actually has 2 header rows. Let me go ahead and zoom in to show you. There we go. We've got one row with the question ID, question 5.1, question 6.1, etc. But it's the row underneath that actually tells me what question was asked. And this is not a real response, so again, we want to exclude that from our analysis. We'll come back to this and how we can use this extra row of data later. So for this one, I'm just going to exclude the nulls for recorded date. There we go. And with that, let me switch back to the slides. So a good way to structure this data is to transpose the columns into just 2, question and response, like that.
Whoa.
In Tableau, this is called pivoting the data. So now we have a row per respondent, per question, and 2 new columns, question and response. Doing this results in a data structure that's easier to work with in Tableau Desktop, since we have fewer dimensions to sift through, and we just use that question text field that I've highlighted there as a filter instead. Remember now, though, that we'll have to use a count distinctive response ID rather than some number of records in some cases to get the correct counts. Notice also that we exclude demographic questions from that pivoting step. In this case, that was ID, name, and role. And this keeps these fields as separate dimensions that we can slice and dice by. Suppose, for example, I wanted to exclude all employees from my analysis. Now this filter applies across all my data. If I had included this question in the pivot step, when we filter on employee, we only filter out the 1 row, so not all the responses from employees, and then that makes my analysis inaccurate. So when you work with survey data, think about what should and shouldn't be included in the pivot in terms of what you may need to filter on later. With prep, you'll see that it's easy to go back and forth and make changes if need be. So here, this is what it's going to look like in desktop. We have the demographic attributes that have been excluded from the pivot step, so they remain as dimensions. In our survey, that's country, your name, the number of conferences you've been to, your role, and what I like to call your Tableau age. So that's how long you've been using Tableau for. And so we can now use these dimensions as usual, so filters or to slice and dice our visualizations. Again, we're going to jump into prep to see how this would work. So back in prep, we're going to go ahead and hit add step and then add pivot. For this one, I'm just going to drag all my questions, so not the demographic fields that have already been renamed. So I'll hold down Shift to multiple select and drag them into this profile card. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see what that does. It creates 2 new columns instead called Pivot 1 Names, which I'll go ahead and rename to Question ID, and then Pivot 1 Values, which is the response given to that question in a text format. And it's as simple as that. If I decided that I wanted to use one of these questions as a filter, I can go ahead and drag this back over to the fields pane so that I can remove it from my analysis. Not quite there yet. A better version of this data set would also give you the option of numerically coded responses. So here we have 1s for yeses, 0s for nos, and then 1 to 5 scales as well for the like it responses. And the reason why this is helpful is it gives us an additional measure to work with so that we can start to compute averages, for example. You can either use a calculated field with logic statements to do this, or we're going to be doing this with a join in our example. So let's go ahead and see how that would work. So this is another common way survey tools typically output their data. You have the option of exporting all the text responses as text, or all the numeric responses as numbers. It's one or the other. And what we typically want is to combine the two together. So let me go ahead and bring out my numeric responses list. And here we can actually remove some of the fields. Things like your name or your country can't be numerically coded. We can't give you a score for your name, no matter how good it is. So let me go ahead and uncheck those. And then we actually, before we can bring these two data sets together, we actually need to repeat the same cleaning and pivoting steps that we did with our text-based response. And when I presented this last year, I'd have to quickly kind of put it together, because I've already explained it, from scratch. Whereas now, something that's new to Tableau Prep is the ability to copy and paste steps. So I can go ahead and copy my cleaning and pivot step, and then just drag my numeric response over as a new input. So now, my pivoted fields are question ID and numeric response. So I just have to go in and change that. Then we can go ahead and join our two data sets together. For those of you who are not familiar with joins, you join two tables on a common key, and it just adds additional columns to enrich the data set. This is just a simple drag and drop operation to join the two tables together. And it's the summary of join results that I'm just going to zoom in on, because it will help me see what exactly is going on. So here, the join clause recommendation suggests response ID as a possible common key. So we'll go ahead and use that. We're using an inner join, so we want to make sure that we keep all the matches across both data sets. But we see something interesting going on here. Both our data sets have 6,520 rows, but when I join them, I end up with 52,000. And that's because, remember, because of that pivoting step, response ID is no longer unique to a row. It's the combination of response ID and question ID together that make a row unique. So I need to go back down to my join clause recommendations and add that in. We'll let the summary of join results refresh, and then we can see we've got the right counts now. The 8 rows that have been excluded come from that respondent that we excluded earlier, the one who probably fell asleep at their laptop. And with that, let's go ahead and jump back to the slides. I've misplaced my clicker. There we are. In some cases, you might only have a question number, so you don't actually know what question was asked unless you're the person that designed the survey. So here you need to use a question helper, which is essentially a lookup that translates those questions into the text of the question that was asked. So that's that table you're seeing on the right-hand side. That question helper can be made even better if we group together common question types, like variations of Likert scale responses, or even these questions that ask you about which product types you use. The reason why you'd want to group these together is, again, to make it easy in Tableau Desktop, because then you can just apply that question grouping field as a filter and analyze a small subset of your questions at once. So again, we're going to jump into prep to see how we can build this out. So remember at the very beginning when I brought in my text responses table and I had that second header row? That's the one we're going to use to create our question lookup table. I'm going to go in and add a branch. This is something that's cool in prep, is you can actually take one input and use it in completely different ways and then bring them back together again. So here, in my data grid, I actually want to just keep the row where it's not a valid response. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on that and say keep only. Here, what we can do is remove all the fields that have already been renamed. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep only the columns that have my question numbers. Again, hold Shift to multiple select and say keep only those columns. So now we're working with a data set where every column is a question ID, and then the row is the question that was asked. So you're probably already figured out where we're headed. We, of course, need to pivot that data again. So we'll go in and add that pivot step, like so. And this time we end up with a column called question ID and a column that I'll call question text. Let's go ahead and add in a clean step to see what this looks like. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this field so that I can use it to group my common question types together. What you'll notice here is I'm going to rename this to question grouping first, is the question that asks you which products do you use always starts the same way, because of course it's going to go, which product do you use? Tableau desktop, online, prep, or server. And because it starts the same way, we can actually use group and replace by spelling to automatically group them together for us. And then I can just go ahead and manually rename it to products. And with the question asking you about your hotel experience, it's not quite the same because each one has been written very differently. It starts with how clean, how quick, so the built-in algorithms aren't going to help us here. Instead, what I can do is manually group them together, so I just hold down Shift to multiple select them, and then group my values myself. And I'll rename this to hotels. And hit done. So now that we have our question lookup table complete, we need to again go ahead and join it together. So let me go ahead and drag and drop this back over. And here Tableau Prep automatically spots that question ID is the common field. And our summary of join results confirms exactly what's going on. There's no response ID in that lookup table, so we just need to join the two tables together. I'll add in a final step. Here, I just want to remove any of the duplicate fields that have been created as a result of that joining. So I'm going to search -1 and remove all of those, and same with -2 for my second join. I think it's already been renamed differently. So this is probably the foundational steps that nearly all survey data will have to undergo. And because it's a repeatable process, what I'd encourage you to do is to select these steps and save them as a separate flow that you can keep coming back to. If you think this is something other teams could benefit from as well, is you can publish this part of the flow to server. And that just means that someone else can take their text and numeric response and then just plug them in as new inputs. They just have to make a couple of tweaks here and there for how their survey might be different. So with that, I'm just going to pause for a moment to recap what we've done so far. It was a bit intense, but I'm just going to leave this up on screen. It's an annotated version of that same flow, just so you can kind of read it, take a moment to breathe while I welcome Danu back to the stage.
Thank you. Wasn't that great? I remember when I watched this for the first time, I really liked understanding why we should pivot the data set and then getting to know what those resulting rows represent. I just really felt like she figured it all out for me. And with that, our data is now well structured for analysis, but we have a few cleaning steps left. In the start of the presentation, Archana discussed close-ended question types, things like single select, multi-select, or Likert scale responses. When we work with survey data, we have an additional question type to deal with, which is open-ended, or free text responses. Now, when it comes to analyzing those questions, our reactions may vary. And this is essentially because free text questions tend to be very challenging because of the amount of data preparation that goes behind it. So let's understand them a bit further. When you think of free text responses, we've noticed two broad categories, starting with short-form free text. Even within short-form free text, we've noticed two subdivisions, the first being questions like this. Questions where the answers fit a generic standard. So things like email addresses or people's social media links. We generally include such questions in our survey to either plan outreach or match it against some internal data set. Now, what we've noticed is that the output that we tend to get tends to look something like this, where people may forget a .com, they may add a comma instead of a full stop, or they just might not type the right response. And ideally, what we'd want to do is we'd like to flag these as not valid responses, because if we were to use any of this in our outreach or matching back, they wouldn't be very helpful. The second kind of short-form responses are questions which may not fit a generic standard, but ideally should conform to a list custom to your organization. So questions like this, where we ask people for their favorite, or the first brand that comes to their mind when they think of morning cereal. The reason we don't include responses in this case is generally so that we don't prime the respondents with a selection of options. We've also seen a second observation of where people use such questions, and that's when the list is too big to include in a survey. But again, we do receive responses which may look something like this, where people may not type it right because of the way they either pronounce it or they just incorrectly type it. We'd like to flag this as invalid, but we'd want to take this a step further and replace it with what we know is the right value. So let's see how Tableau Prep can help us out with that. So I'm going to switch over to a flow where we've added all the descriptions of what Archana had just done. So let's start with a new step from where we'd stopped off the last time, which was removing those fields. I'm going to go over to the first question type, which is where we collected people's email addresses. So when I go over here, immediately I see that there's this certain value which I want to flag out, and visually I see that this is incorrect. I could manually scroll down and start looking for other emails which don't make sense, but what I also notice is that this column itself has over 546 unique values. Manually going through each of this is one of the biggest reasons why free text can be challenging to work with. So I'm going to use Tableau's recommendations, and it's recommending that I change this data role to an email address. And what that will do is that it will identify anything that doesn't conform to what I expect. So when I press apply, you can see that that one value which didn't make sense has been, in fact, flagged out by Tableau as well. To make my life a little easier, I'll show all those values which don't make too much sense. And now we've gone down to 7 values. There's some of this that I may manually go through, but first I'll just do some quick cleaning steps. So let's remove spaces, because technically email addresses shouldn't have any spaces. And that didn't make too much of a difference, but it did bring it down to 6 unique values. Now for the ones that are left, I can manually clean those up and remove things that I can tell doesn't make too much sense. Now with these 4 that I have left, it's a little bit hard to figure out what the correct response should have been. So what I could choose to do is either branch this out and send it back to my marketing team, remove them from my analysis altogether, but for now I'll just leave it in. So let's go over to the second question that we come across, which is those kind of questions which fit that list custom to my organization. In this case, in that survey that we'd run, that question is which company are people from? This column itself has been anonymized for this demo, but if any of you have used Superstore, these are the names that you'd see there. So here, immediately, you can see that there are some responses which don't quite match up. And in this case, I know that Anne Frost is the right way to have entered, or the right company name that I should have expected. So again, I will leverage on that data role, but this time I'm going to leverage on something called custom data roles. So what this is, let me scroll down a bit. So what this is essentially is a predefined list that I had published to Tableau server of all the values that I expect to receive within this column. In this case, I published a list of the clean organization names. So you can see that Tableau is mentioning that there are 91 values, so I should ideally receive no more than 91 unique names. And I can see a brief overview, so I know that this is what I'm looking for. So you can see that Annie Frost has been flagged out as invalid. So again, if I wanted to see how many were really invalid, I can click on not valid and see there are 8 values that don't quite add up. I could manually edit them, but then I also know that I may not know all those actual names or the way I've stored it back in my data set. So instead, I'm going to use that smart algorithm that Archana had used earlier, called group and replace by spelling. Essentially, what this does, it looks at the common characters and starts grouping those values which have common characters. I can see that Anne Frost has been dealt with, but if I scroll down a little bit, I see that Assurity Corp and Assurity Corporation hasn't been. So what I'll do is I'll ask Tableau Prep to increase the intensity of the way it applies this algorithm, which essentially means that it'll be checking against more characters. And then I can see that that's been grouped together as well. So if you keep scrolling down, you'll start seeing all those values which didn't quite make sense have now been put together. And I am down to those 91 companies that I was expecting. With that, I can output this main survey data set. So I'll go ahead and press output. So for those of you who are new to Tableau Prep, when you create an output, you have a choice of 2, and as of yesterday, it'll be a choice of 3, where you can either save it to a file, which basically creates a local file within your computer. You could publish this as a data source. So if you're familiar with Tableau, you know Tableau data sources, which means that anyone can connect to that data source from your organization directly from Tableau server. And if you leverage on Prep Conductor, you can get these flows to schedule on a timely basis. So I can publish this as a data source, select which project I want to publish this to, and call this survey output. So for now, I have run this, so I won't do it at this point, and switch back to my slides. Right. So with that, we dealt with the first free text response. I know what all of you are waiting for, long-form free text. So this one is essentially those questions where we expect the respondent to be descriptive. So we expect them to add descriptions that go longer than just a few words. So questions like this, where we ask for comments or feedback. The focus here is generally to break those comments down and find patterns and frequencies within them. Now, there are a lot of packages within the R and Python environment, like sentiment analysis or intent detection, that help you do this. To bring those packages into Tableau Prep, you can now use the scripts function. So I'm going to go over how this works, because it is relatively new to the product. So this function works as any other function would in Tableau Prep. So you can go ahead and add the step with that plus icon and choose script instead of the others. And like you will see in just a brief while, it will prompt you with where your RServe is located, add in a few credentials, add the file that you need or which contains your script. And once the connection has been made, Tableau Prep will send a data frame to the R or Python environment. Whatever scripts being written out in the R or Python environment would take that data frame as an input and then send back a data frame to Tableau Prep. The schema of this output doesn't need to be the same as what you send in the input, so you can independently define that. And what that looks like essentially in Prep is any other data set. So you can go ahead and clean it up, you can aggregate it, or you can output this directly. So let's see how this works in practice. Now I'm going to demonstrate one use case of the script. But we do have a lot of people in our community who've done some really exciting things with this functionality and really does open up a whole world of functionalities. So I'm going to go and add, oops, not that. I'll add a branch to what we had earlier. And we'll go over to those comments that we received. And let's expand this a bit and see what people talked about. So of course, people talked about the Data Plus Women event. I don't know how many of you were able to attend it. I got to go for it earlier this week, thanks to Archana actually. Made a few friends out of it actually. So there are Data Women events happening in each city, and I am marketing this. Archana leads it in UK, so in case you are looking for her, do find out about what's happening there. Then, of course, people talked about Data Night Out. I was still rubbing off the the neon off in the morning. And people talked about data and Tableau and how much they love it, which is all good things. So now essentially what I want to understand in this case is what were the words which were said the most, and what was the sentiment attached to it. So was it positive, negative, fairly neutral? So that's when I'll add a script function. In this case, I do use the sentiment analysis from R. So you'll see the first thing Tableau will request for is what kind of connection are we setting up? Is it R, Python? And then you'll have to enter the login credentials for that connection. Add in the file that contains the script. So I'm not an R developer myself, but I had a desk buddy, Rudy, actually. So Rudy, in case you're watching this, although I know it's really early, thank you very much, who wrote this out for me. And he also told me that the function's called getSentiment function, which I'll add in here. And now we'll let it do its magic. So essentially what's happening now is the output is getting processed in R or Python, and that comments given has been taken as an input, and the way the script was set out, it gave me the number of words which I was looking for and the sentiment value as the output. So within this itself, I can do a bit of quick analytics. I'll remove all the null values, and I want to see which were the most frequently said words, so I'll sort this highest to lowest, and I can see people said Tableau, love, data, prep, excited, all the things you want to hear when you're giving a Tableau prep session. Then I want to see what was the kind of sentiment that people attached to this, and I can see that people were fairly neutral with what they were saying, because things like Tableau, data, prep, although they mean so much to us, don't really have much of a polarity to it. So with this, I am ready to output this, and I want to visualize this in Tableau Desktop. So I'm going to add this output. In this case, I'll just save it to File. I'll choose a place to save this and call it Sentiment Score. And with that, we will switch back to the slides and go over the very few steps that we've done together. And I'll call Archana back to show you how to visualize this. Just a brief note, Archana did get a lot more into the visualizations in her last year's session. So in case you would like to get into that further, you're more curious to understand how to go through all those question types that she discussed in the starting, I do recommend checking that out on YouTube. It has the same name as this session.
How about that? Open text responses have always been a challenge, and it's part of the reason why I didn't get the chance to cover them last year. But Dhan's shown us how Prep can now not only clean the data, but actually turbocharge it by using those scripts to add even more information into our data sets. Now that our data is finally in the right shape and cleaned up, let's get into Desktop to start vizzing this data. The fun bit. So this is the dashboard we're aiming for. So it's just got 4 simple visualizations. As Dhanu said, this year, because we wanted to show you a lot more prep, we're spending a little bit less time in Desktop, but that doesn't mean you're missing out on content, because in the workbook we'll send to you after conference, we'll send a version with loads more extra vizzes for extra inspiration, for best design practices, as well as different ways of doing it that are also more performant as well, and it's all been commented out for you. So we're keeping it simple this time around. So let me go ahead and exit out of presentation mode and build a new sheet. So in this data set, I've already connected to my survey responses and my sentiment score extract. So we're just going to jump straight into the building piece. When I do that, I want to just take a moment to remind you again what that reshaping actually means. So here, if I bring out number of records, we have that value of 6,520 rows that we saw earlier, but this is not how many people completed the survey. That number is our count distinctive response ID, and we can compare the two and see that we only had the 815. So remember, number of records is a record per response per question, whereas count distinctive response ID is what we're going to be mostly using. So let me go ahead and get rid of number of records. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring out Tableau age. Remember, that's how long people have have been using Tableau for. And we can see that most people have been using Tableau for over 5 years. To make this view a little bit more helpful, let me go ahead and sort this. Oops. So less than 6 months, 6 to 12, and then anyone else who's been using it over a year. Then I'll go ahead and also cross-compare this with my number of TCs. And this is an example of where that pivoting becomes really important, because I'm able to use these as dimensions to separately slice and dice the data. I'm going to go ahead and move this over to color to give me a nice little heat map as well. And it turns out from our last year's survey, while most of the respondents come from, have been using Tableau for a while, so come from an experienced background, a lot of them are first-time attendees still. Anyone fit that box at the moment? Been using Tableau a while, but this is their first conference? Wow, thank you for coming, finally. About time. Let me go ahead and build out the next sheet that we're going to need. For this one, I'm going to be looking at my multiple select responses. So let me go ahead and again bring out my count distinct of response ID. And we're going to go ahead and break it down by my text response. Here, though, what we're seeing is the response to every single question in the survey. And this is where that question text field, question grouping field comes in handy, because I can go ahead and drop it on filters and analyze the subset of questions that refer to the which products do you use question type. And then I can go ahead and remove my nulls, just exclude them, and then I have a simple bar chart. The last visualization I'm going to be creating is one looking at Likert scale scores. For this, I'm going to go ahead and bring out, again, question grouping onto my filters shelf, and just filter it to the subset of questions asking people about their hotel experience. Then I'm going to bring out question text, so this is the question that was actually asked, and set this to entire view, and just expand this out so we can actually read it. For this one, I'm going to bring out numeric response, and I'll right-click and drag this so that I can select an average. And for me, I don't particularly want to use a bar for this, as there's a fixed axis. We know that the scale ends at 5 in this case. So let me go ahead and just lock that down, and also change the mark type to a circle. There we go. This version, this way of looking at it gives us a helpful quick snap judgment of what the average ratings are. But I think for more users, you would want the underlying distributions to give you that granularity of if it leans more heavily one way or another. And a really nice way to do that is by using Viz in Tooltip. So for that, if I hover over one of these, I've pre-built this. Again, it will be in the workbook that we'll share with you guys afterwards. We've built a separate visualization showing me bars with the percentage totals of how many respondents gave each of the possible scores. So that when I hover, I get to see that underlying distribution, but on my dashboard, they don't see that. And it's a nice way, again, to add that information without overwhelming your end users when they look at it. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dana to show you how she's going to put together the sentiment analysis, as well as the final few sheets in a dashboard.
Okay. So when we created that sentiment score, we essentially created a 2-column data set, one which contains all the words and one which contains the sentiment value. So you can see that's brought into Tableau. And of course, Tableau always brings in that number of records. So the first question that I was going to ask was which word was said the most. So I'm going to click on word, number of records, choose show me, and then choose that default tree map, but switch that mark type over to a text. So I get that word cloud that I'm looking for. So I do want to leverage on the sentiment value that I calculated, so I'll add that to color. The only thing though here is that we see Tableau has used some of sentiment value, which isn't completely correct because it's going to weigh the value itself with the number of times that word was mentioned. So let's switch this over to an average. And that puts together the first visualization, or the visualization we wanted with our word cloud. I'm going to remove the things that I don't really want to see here. And with that, we do have our sentiment dashboard created, or sentiment viz created. And we put them together earlier to save some time. And you can see that this would be a sample of the kind of dashboard you could build in. Now, if you remember right in the starting, Archana did talk about the pivoting, and she has talked about where you would use that slice and dice, and this is exactly where it comes out most frequently. So we remove things like age and number of TCs, essentially because if I wanted to see people who've been using Tableau for a while, what did they respond across the questions, this is what allows me to do it. So a lot of you would be familiar with using a sheet as a filter, so that's essentially what we've done here. And let's say I'm curious to understand my fellow first-timers and maybe people who've been using Tableau for a relatively short period, which product are they using the most? So it seems like they're still following the generic trend. Most people are starting with desktop. I'm hoping this session kind of changes these numbers a bit, and next year's survey looks a little bit more towards prep. I mean, you can continue using desktop, of course, though. But what I also notice is that their check-in process doesn't seem to have gone very smoothly. So if I just wanted to compare that with people who've been coming to conference for a while, I can see that they had an average score which was a little bit smoother, so better check-in process. So essentially, everyone who's coming to conference for the first time, do meet up with the people who've been coming here. They may help you with your check-in process along with everything else in Tableau. So now we can switch back because I think Archana does have to have some resources to share of other people who've been using Tableau for a while.
So I specifically want to shout out a couple of our Zen Masters whose content has been really helpful to us in putting together this session. Steve Wexler, who I can actually see there at the back. Hi, Steve. Emma White and Josh Milligan. All of them are Tableau Zen Masters, and their resources have been so helpful to us in the past, so I definitely recommend you check them out, especially for the visualization inspiration. The Zen Masters for a reason. Of course, it goes without saying Tableau's own website has some resources. My blog posts are at tinyurl.com/archblogs. And then our on-demand training, and I specifically recommend that pivoting one, because I think that's the key takeaway here, is almost in 90% of cases with survey data that I've come across, you'll need to pivot that data, just like Ross says. And as we're presenting on a Friday, there aren't many related sessions that we can share with you. So ones to check out on YouTube, you can catch Tableau's own, Anton, presenting advanced prep features that we showed. So that's the script functions, the custom data roles, some of the new things later on YouTube. Or you can also already check out one of our customer speakers. So Osha Health presented a real-life use case for using prep and desktop with survey data. And then if you are sticking around after this session, still at conference, then I've got 2 sessions that are recommended as well. So another 2 examples of how customers have been using survey data with Tableau Prep. So we've got the Center for Creative Leadership as well as Stanford Healthcare. So if you do have the chance, go ahead and check those 2 out as well.
And take it from me, a lot can happen in a year. So you may find your Archana there and be presenting up here next year. And of course, please don't forget to rate our session, because we would also like to be back here next year. So do go ahead and rate our session, because that's going to help us shape our content better. And with that, we would like to
thank you.